Hey guys, it's Dustin here with Caffeine Interactive, and I want to talk to you real quick about the three tiers of website development support. Now we get this question all the time, and I thought it'd be easier just to record a video to kind of break down these three options. And so the three options you kind of have are the DIY tier, do-it-yourself tier, that is, the freelancer tier, hiring a freelancer, or the hire an agency approach. And so of those three tiers, I kind of break those down and give you the pros and cons of each one. So you want to look at the DIY approach. By far, the biggest pro with that is the cost. You're talking about maybe a few $100s, even that, to get a website off the ground. This is great if you're a startup. Maybe you start a new business. You have a very limited budget. Maybe you're saying, I've got a few $1,000s in my pocket. I got to use this money to build my website, to get my business cards together, maybe put a logo together, maybe some other supplies for my business, maybe marketing, advertising expenses, those sort of things. You're looking at that whole aggregate of all these needs. There's no reason to put the majority of your budget towards a website if you have these other things that are essential for your business. So DIY is a great approach. The downside is going to be that you're going to outgrow that very fast. If your business is successful, if you want any kind of marketing automation, any kind of more advanced stuff in your website, any kind of deeper customizations in your website, you're going to quickly find that the DIY approach is going to be very limiting. And typically that means you have to go and rewrite your site. And so, next tier up from that, if you don't want to go the DIY approach, the next step is hiring a freelancer. Pros with that is going to be cheaper than an agency model. It's going to be more expensive than DIY approach. You have a real expert who's going in and helping you build your website or support your website. Couple downsides with that. One, typically they're kind of a jack of all trades approach with this. So, this person is going to be responsible for all the custom coding on your website, all the IT support on your website, the user interface, the user experience, the graphics design, the project management. And typically what you find is when you hire a freelancer, they're going to be strong at maybe one or two of those things at best, and then be weak at the others. And so you see things where you have a really powerful website, but the flow, the user experience of the site suffers, or the aesthetics of the site just don't really pop. You see a site that really pops and is super strong aesthetically, but the actual usability of the site is really difficult. It's hard to navigate. So you kind of want to, mix and match between that. And that's where the agency model really, really shines, because you get a separation of all those different disciplines, and you have different stakeholders responsible for the success of your website. The other downside with the freelancer model is if you ever talk to someone who said, yeah, I hired this guy, he's really good at first, and then he kind of just, he wasn't as responsive anymore. I'd send him a request and he'd take 2 or 3 weeks before he'd get back to me. That's very typical with freelancers, because they're constantly looking for their next project. They've got other people competing for their finite set of resources, typically just the time that they have to dedicate to this. And so you may find yourself, buried down in the queue if you have an urgent need, but that freelancer has other urgent requests popping up, and they're trying to, prioritize your needs versus everyone else's. And so, those are really the two biggest downsides to hiring a freelancer. And that's where the agency model comes in, because agencies are typically staffed to be able to handle the peak needs of all of their customers. And so within the agency model, that we like to think of it, there's really 3 sub tiers that I like to break down within the agency model. The first sub tier is the offshore tier. This is where you go and hire an offshore agency to build your website. The second tier is the domestic option, where you hire a domestic US based agency where all their employees are based here in the US, and hire them. And then the third tier is the term that we coined, called the hybrid approach, the hybrid agency. And I'll explain that a little bit here in a second. So if you think about the offshore tier, pros and cons there. Cost is one of the biggest pros. You can typically, it's typically a lot cheaper to hire an offshore agency than it is to hire a domestic agency, which is great. The downsides of that is that a lot of times things get lost in translation. A lot of times these offshore agencies are more about quantity over quality. To touch on the loss in translation piece. So think about this, if you're a US based company, you're doing business with US based customers using based in a US based culture, US based customs, US based systems. Think about the system, just think about something like the system we use for addresses here in the United States, a street address, the zip code, the city and state. A lot of times you go offshore, you go to another country, the way they reference addresses are completely different. If you've ever traveled internationally and looked at an international address, and tried to make sense of how you interpret this, what is the street name, what is the whatever. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing. And so just for something simple like that, if you had some kind of application where you're trying to build something that involved addresses, you may have some translation issues just trying to explain this is how it's supposed to work. here in the US and trying to translate that over to an offshore team so they can understand that. That's a real simple example. There's other examples like that, phone numbers, phone systems like that. There's other things like when it comes to like just how to copywriting is a classic example too. You go offshore, sometimes the copywriting doesn't come through as well. And so, you want to think about that when working with an offshore agency, and because they focus on quantity often over quality, they're just trying to move things through. And that's where you hear some of these horror stories about, I hired this agency over in India, or this agency, down in South America, over in Asia somewhere, Eastern Europe. And, they spoke a good, the conversations were well, we had good dialogue, but then at the end of the day, the product they delivered didn't quite match what I was expecting. And I was kind of horrified. You hear some of those horror stories. And so that's the downside. There's definitely some risk when you go with a pure offshore agency. So the counter to that is going domestic, obviously, right? You hire an agency based here in the US. It's going to be probably the least risk, but it's also by far going to be the most expensive option. So this is where you're spending, lots and lots of money on a website. Now, the advantage is, especially if you get someone local, you can go down and meet with your web development team anytime you need to, which is kind of nice. Some people really prefer that. But the downside of that is, you're going to be paying for it. And so that's where we've kind of stepped in and coined this term of hybrid approach to agency and website development. The idea behind the hybrid approach is this. Let's take an example. This example I like to use, the construction industry. Let's say you're going to build a house. You take all the different disciplines that go into building a house, right? So you have an architect who's doing all the designing and doing the floor planning of how your house is going to be laid out, where the kitchen is going to be in relation to the master bedroom. Within the kitchen, where's the refrigerator going to be in relation to the sink? And what do? They build these blueprints and they charge you a fortune, right? Architects are expensive. Their hourly rate is usually pretty high. But they take care of all the requirements and all the specifications. So it's very clear what constitutes success when the team downstream from them, the actual implementation team, that is the construction workers, come in with hammers and nails and wood and everything else and start building this. They know exactly what constitutes success because they did such a great job planning it up front. It's very clear what constitutes success and failure. Same thing like interior designer, person who's responsible helping you pick out your color scheme and the flow of the house and how you want everything to look, the countertops, the color of the cabinets, all that sort of stuff. These are typically higher paid disciplines than the implementation team. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily, maybe think of it more as a craftsman skill or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're necessarily more skilled. It just means those are specific needs that if you get that right, everything else downstream that depends on that functions way easier and the process works way better than if those things are fragmented or broken. And so what we do with the hybrid models, we really focus on within our agency, making sure that people interface with our customers, particularly business analysts, project managers, people are responsible for making sure the project's running on time, making sure we get all the requirements nailed down, making sure the design and aesthetics of the website are rock solid. We base that around a US-based approach so that we completely understand the cultural needs, the customer needs, being a US-based, typically US-based customers who we're building sites for. So we understand all of that. And that way we lock everything down, get it rock solid. So when we bring in our developers, it's very clear what constitutes success and what constitutes failure. And obviously that helps mitigate risk pretty significantly. And the advantage of that is, the other advantages as well, several advantages. One is, when we think about hiring software developers, well, the software space here in the United States is one of the most competitive spaces, one of the most competitive industries. Trying to hire and retain a software developer is super time consuming, super expensive, a lot of turnover, people moving to better opportunities and things like that. And so, by opening it up to more of a global presence, gives us a little bit of an advantage to be able to hire some of the best talent throughout the world because they're, really great developers all over the world that compare to US based developers, but where they often find themselves falling short is because they don't have a good set of requirements because that stuff wasn't lined up correctly at the beginning of the project. And so our approach with the hybrid approach is to leverage domestic resources for those important user interfacing things where we're looking at lockdown requirements and make sure it's very clear what it is we're building, and then working with an offshore team to do the implementation. And so that's the idea behind a hybrid approach. They really, again, all all three of these tiers and the three sub tiers under agencies are all viable for different situations. I don't sit here and say you should always hire an agency. If you're not going to hire an agency, don't build a website, because I think that's silly. Again, if you're a startup and you have a very limited budget, going the DIY approach may be the only way you can viably have a website. And that's better than not having a website. So it's certainly a viable option. Likewise, if you're going the agency approach, you can go throw money at a US based agency and spend a lot, or you can go take the risk with an offshore agency, or you can try to mitigate some of that offshore risk while also saving money with going with the hybrid approach like we provide. It's just a matter of your needs and what it is you're looking to accomplish. So hope this kind of explains how we work and the different options you have when you're talking about building a website or getting support on your website. If you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to us at Caffeine Interactive, and thank you so much for your time.